Lord Hadrian Kell, Viscount of Marlstone, received the letter on a grey Tuesday morning in November, and he set it aside before finishing the third line. Now, my dear friends, I want you to picture that morning clearly. The fire going low, the Admiralty reports stacked on the corner of his desk, a man so certain of his own competence that uncertainty had become, for him, something that happened to other people. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was small and exact. The sender's name appeared beneath the return address without apology or decoration. Miss Miriam Slade, of Westhaven, Yorkshire. He had never heard of her. He had not particularly expected to. The letter concerned the northern maritime route, a new shipping lane that Lord Kell had spent 11 months negotiating past the Admiralty Board, past 3 committees, past a dozen investors who had found, eventually, that his certainty was more persuasive than their hesitation. The route would carry wool and coal freighters 4 days faster than the existing passage. 4 days faster than the existing passage. It would breathe commerce back into ports that had been slowly going quiet. It was the greatest professional undertaking of his career, and it was, by every expert assessment available to him, entirely safe. Miss Miriam Slade believed it would sink ships. Specifically, she believed the Callow Ledge, a sandstone shelf lying 12 feet below mean water level, certified by Summer Survey, sitting politely beneath the proposed bearing, would, in winter surge conditions, with a fully laden freighter drawing 16 feet of draft, rise close enough to the hull to constitute a catastrophe. Another objection? Asked Mr. Crispin Dove, Lord Kell's secretary, a lean man of 40 who had developed, over 7 years of service, the art of delivering difficult information as though it were pleasant weather. A woman from a fishing village believes she understands Admiralty charting, Lord Kell said. What does she recommend? He skimmed the page. A winter sounding of the Callow Ledge before the route carries its first vessel, and moving the entry bearing 6 degrees north. He set the letter on the corner of his desk where correspondence waited indefinitely. Reply to Miss Slade. Thank her for her concern. Inform her the board's survey teams have certified the route. Crispin lifted the letter. He held it a moment. There are tide measurements attached, my lord. There are figures in many arguments that remain wrong. Lord Kell reached for the next report. A courteous refusal, nothing more. The refusal reached Westhaven 4 days later. Miriam Slade read it in the back room of her uncle's chemist shop on Anchor Row, at the table where her father's tide journals lived in stacked order, 43 leather volumes, each one a year of mornings on the Westhaven breakwater. The reply was perfectly polite. Lord Kell's secretary had written with elegance and warmth. His lordship thanked her for her concern. His lordship assured her that eminent professionals had certified the route. His lordship hoped the new lane would bring considerable prosperity to the northern coast. It was a letter that said nothing while saying it beautifully. Her uncle, Dr. Joseph Slade, a retired ship's physician with excellent eyebrows and the habit of knowing when not to speak, looked up from the medicine shelf he was arranging. Did he address the calculations? No. How do you know? She set the letter on the table beside the tide journals. Because no one who read these figures would send that. She took out fresh paper. Your lordship, she wrote. The board's summer sounding measured the Callow Ledge at 12 feet below mean water. I do not dispute this figure. I dispute its sufficiency. A winter-loaded freighter of the class scheduled for this route draws 14 feet at rest and 16 in surge. Your surveyors measured the ledge in August. The ledge in August is not the ledge in January. I am enclosing 8 years of seasonal measurements taken from a fixed point on the Westhaven breakwater, cross-referenced against storm records held by the Fishermen's Guild. I ask only one thing. Commission a December sounding at the Callow Ledge before the first commercial vessel runs this bearing. If I am wrong, the cost is small. If I am correct, the cost of refusing will not be. Miss Miriam Slade. She enclosed a diagram showing the ledge's seasonal movement across 8 winters. She enclosed a second showing the entry angle, how the proposed bearing ran 16 degrees off the winter prevailing current, which would push incoming vessels east, directly toward the ledge's shallowest point. Joseph read both letters before she sealed the envelope. You have made it difficult for him to ignore you a second time. He ignored the first one easily enough. Then perhaps difficulty requires practice. She had been practicing for years. Her father, Samuel Slade, had been a harbor pilot, one of those quiet, essential men who knew the sea not through instruments alone, but through the accumulated understanding of 10,000 mornings watching how light moved on the water. He had brought Miriam to the dock at age 6 to watch him read the current. By 9, she was copying his tide journals into fresh ledgers, when the old ones grew illegible with salt and age. By 13, she was making corrections. Her father looked at one of these corrections for several weeks before he said anything. Then he placed a copy of Smythe's Practical Navigation on the table in front of her and said, "You have already understood most of this. Read the rest." She did. She read everything else she could find. When he died of fever in the spring of her 21st year, he left her his pilot's commission, which she could not hold because she was a woman, and his journals, which she could hold because no one thought to take them. She moved in with Uncle Joseph and continued the records. Not because the harbor authority asked, because she was the only person left in Westhaven who understood what the journals were saying. What they were saying that particular autumn was this: the Callow ledge was rising. 7 inches over 8 years. Driven by storm compaction and altered sediment from the new mill upstream on the River Wen. 7 inches that would not matter in August and would matter enormously in January, when surge conditions pushed a heavy freighter's keel 2 feet lower than any summer survey would predict. She had checked her calculations 3 times against a scale model she built at the kitchen table. Then she wrote to Lord Kell. He sent a courteous refusal. She sent the second letter and waited. Lord Kell received it during a planning session with investors and his lead hydrographer. Mr. Fletcher Pellet, formerly of the Royal Navy Survey Corps, a man with silver-buttoned coats and the manner of someone who considered questions an interruption. Lord Kell read it while Pellet discussed projected toll revenues. The figures were not vague. They were not the kind of vague that could be dismissed. He recognized this the way a man with scientific training recognizes a thing he does not wish to be true, with a particular quality of irritation that has less to do with the claim and more to do with what accepting it will require. "Dove," he said. Crispin appeared. "Ask Mr. Pellet whether a December sounding has been taken at the Callow ledge." Pellet turned from his charts. The summer survey was comprehensive. She does not question the summer survey. Lord Kell placed the letter on the map table. She is asking about January. Has a winter sounding been taken? A pause just long enough to be an answer. It was not considered necessary given. Commission 1. My lord, if we respond to every anxious. This observer has attached 8 years of tide records. Lord Kell looked at him steadily. If she is wrong, the sounding proves you correct at modest expense. If she is right, we will be grateful someone noticed. He picked up his coat. Commission it. My dear friends, let me ask you to sit with that moment for just a breath. A man with every reason to protect his investment and his timeline, choosing instead to test the assumption rather than dismiss the voice. It was not yet belief. It was not heroism. It was simply the correct decision, made narrowly, almost against his will. Sometimes that is how things begin to change. If this is your first time joining me here at Moonlight at Marlowe, welcome. Subscribe if you'd like more stories as like this one now. Back to the ledge and to December. The sounding took 3 weeks. Lord Kell received the results on a Thursday evening and read them alone. The Callow ledge had risen 7.5 inches since August. In winter surge conditions, it would present less than 3 feet of clearance for a laden freighter on the proposed bearing. Miss Slade's seasonal measurements matched the survey findings within 4 inches. Her entry angle concern was confirmed. He read both her letters again, then again. There was no guesswork in them, no sentimental alarm, no fortunate intuition. Only observation accumulated across years and applied with the precision that qualified men were paid to provide, and had not. He wrote the reply himself. He did not have Crispin draft it. Miss Slade. The December sounding confirms movement in the Calais ledge, consistent with your measurements. The bearing will be corrected. I acknowledge that I set aside your first letter too quickly. If you are willing, I would like to know how you obtained 8 years of tidal records for a feature that appears on no instrument chart. Marlstone. She read the final line twice. He had signed it himself. He acknowledged it, Joseph said, watching from across the room. Partly, she said. For a Viscount, that may be all that is initially available. She took out fresh paper. I'll write back. Her reply explained the tide journals, the guild records, the winters spent in a cold back room copying measurements, while the guild secretary expressed periodic doubt about her purpose. She enclosed one more diagram, not of the ledge, but of the sandbar. The corrected bearing would solve the ledge problem. It would not solve the current problem. The entry approach still ran against a sandbar that had extended 40 feet east of its charted position, which no vessel crossing in February, losing steerage in the surge current, would discover until it was too late. He received this letter during a meeting and felt a specific irritation. The kind that comes not from being challenged, but from recognizing the challenge is correct. He sent the diagram to Pellet without identifying the author. Pellet replied that the sandbar displacement fell within accepted tolerances. Lord Kell wrote to Miss Slade. The board considers the displacement within acceptable margins. She answered. The board's margins were established for smaller vessel classes than those this route will eventually carry. He wrote, the larger vessels have not yet been approved. She answered, they will be. Within 2 years, given the commercial pressure. You are designing for the ships you have. I am asking you to design for the ships you will have. He ordered his carriage. Westhaven sat 43 miles north over a road that was tolerable in September and navigable in December for those who did not mind arriving cold. He did not announce himself. He told himself he was confirming survey results in person. He told himself this was professional due diligence. He was also, though he did not tell himself this, curious. He found her on the breakwater in an oilskin coat, holding a weighted line over the water, counting seconds under her breath, while a boy of 14 recorded numbers on a wax tablet. He had expected someone severe, possibly elderly. He had not considered carefully enough what 8 years of precise, unacknowledged work does to a person's bearing. How it produces not bitterness, necessarily, but a kind of quiet authority that has nothing to prove to anyone. He descended the dock steps. Miss Slade. She turned. The line swung. The boy caught it without looking, a reflex that suggested this interruption was not unprecedented. Yes. She looked at him without recognition. Lord Kell, Viscount of Marlstone. Her expression changed, not to awe or agitation, but to calibration, as though she were adjusting her understanding of the situation rather than her position within it. I was not expecting you until Friday. I came without announcement. That was inconvenient. She looked toward the boy. Kit, 4 fathoms and 2 feet, and keep counting until I return. She climbed the dock steps. He offered his hand. She looked at it, then at her own, salt-wet and cold. You'll ruin your gloves. I have others. She accepted. Her grip was direct. When she reached the top, she released him and turned immediately toward the channel mouth. You came about the sandbar. I came to understand how you surveyed it. We release weighted floats at the river bar and measure the drift as they pass below. The sandbar's eastern edge deflects them 2 degrees off, true in summer and 6 in February. 6 degrees at standard approach speed is the difference between safe passage and lost rudder response within 90 seconds. This breakwater geometry differs from the channel mouth. Yes, I surveyed the channel mouth as well, a pause, since August. Before writing to me. Before the first letter. He looked at her. Why spend this time? The safety risk falls to others. She turned toward the village, toward the harbour road, the clustered rooftops, the shop windows going yellow in the early dark. My uncle's chemist shop is on Anchor Row. The fishermen's families live in the lower streets. If the route succeeds, the northern ports receive commerce. If it fails, Westhaven receives something else. Her voice remained even. I measured because I needed to be correct before I said I was. The answer struck him somewhere he had not prepared for. It was his own discipline returned to him in another voice. The insistence on measurement before assertion, evidence before argument. He was not comfortable with the comparison, and he understood with some precision why. "May I see your records?" he said. She handed him the wax tablet without ceremony, and walked toward the village without looking back to see whether he followed. He followed. The chemist's shop smelled of wintergreen and lamp oil and old paper. Miriam's room was up a steep back stair, and when Lord Kell entered it, he stopped. The room held more tide journals than furniture. On the central table, spread flat under glass, was a chart, hand-drawn, marked in 3 colors of ink, annotated in margins so dense with notation the paper barely showed between the figures. On the windowsill sat a scale model of the channel mouth, tin sheeting, wire, a grooved track for small weighted pellets simulating draft depth, a hand pump feeding water through the model. A painted line marked the flood level for the lower harbour streets. He stood over the chart for a long moment. "You built all of this," he said. "Yes." "The model as well." "The chart took 2 years. The model took 4 months. She moved the pump lever. A thin current ran through the channel. I'll show you the sandbar problem." She released a pellet into the model. It drifted east, then another, then 6 more, from slightly varying angles. 3 passed through cleanly. 5 pressed against the eastern bank. "Those 5, she said, represent vessels approaching on the original bearing in February surge." He watched the model for a long time. "What is the extent of your training?" he asked at last. "My father taught me navigation. After his death, I taught myself hydrographic surveying, tidal mechanics and coastal analysis from his library and from correspondence with the guild." She moved toward the window. No institution admitted women when I inquired. There was no bitterness in this. It was the tone of a person who has mapped the terrain and simply decided to cross it regardless. He looked again at the chart, at the notation style in the margins, specific, compressed, using a particular shorthand for drift rate calculation that he had encountered before. "Miss Slade, do you publish?" A fractional pause. "I have done." "Under what name?" A longer pause. "M. Slade." The room did something peculiar, or perhaps Lord Kell did. M. Slade was not unknown to him. M. Slade had published 4 papers in 3 years, a study of secondary current behavior in shallow channels, a correction to the Board of Trade's standard formula for sandbar migration rates, a paper on seasonal variance in drift angle measurement that the Naval Review had called provocative and almost certainly wrong, in an editorial that Lord Kell himself had written. He had argued with M. Slade in print for 18 months. He had imagined a retired naval officer, a university lecturer in the north, someone with access to proper survey equipment and an institutional address. It had not occurred to him to imagine otherwise. This failure of imagination was not comfortable to examine. "You wrote the correction to the migration formula," he said. "Yes." 2 years ago. "Yes." "I wrote a formal rebuttal." "I know." A pause with the weight of considerable restraint behind it. "I answered it." He remembered the answer. It had been precise and unhurried, and had dismantled 2 of his 3 central arguments, with a thoroughness he had found both genuinely impressive and deeply inconvenient. "You knew who I was when I arrived," he said. "Your rebuttal was signed. And you said nothing." She looked at him steadily. "You dismissed the first letter without reading the calculations. I did not think informing you that we had already argued in print for a year would improve your attention." She moved toward the window. "Your secretary's first draft contained the phrase feminine interference. The final version thanked me for my concern. The meaning was the same." He wanted to dispute this. He could not. "I came here after the survey proved you right," he said. "Yes. And now you know that the mind you were arguing against in the Naval Review, the mind you called commendably rigorous but fatally limited by a failure to understand applied conditions, was writing to you from this room." "Yes." She looked at the model. "And you know that you dismissed the woman by name that you respected by initial." There was a silence that had, underneath it, the weight of an honest accounting. "What would correct the bearing fully?" he asked at last. She showed him. The revised approach, with its adjusted sandbar compensation, required changes to 2 sections of the original route specification, manageable, not catastrophic. She had, of course, already calculated the full revision. The following Thursday she arrived at the Admiralty Board's regional office, with her charts season case and her father's journals in a canvas bag, and she opened her case on the meeting table without waiting for anyone to invite her to do so. Fletcher Pellet looked at her, and then at Lord Kell, and said, "I understood this was a technical review." "Miss Slade identified the Callow Ledge problem," Lord Kell said. "She is here as the lead analyst. She has no credentials. She has published 4 papers under Naval Board review. Under initials. Under her authorship." Lord Kell did not adjust his tone. "Shall we begin?" She began with the data. The tide records first, then the model diagrams, then the sandbar projection, not as it stood now, but as it would stand in 2 years, in 5 under the vessel traffic this route would carry. Then the corrected approach specification, step by step, in the format the board used for its own publications. And in one place, with a quiet precision that stopped the room, a correction to a density variable in Pellet's own published tables, which had been applied twice in column 4, and which had been altering material weight estimates by 3% for 2 years. Pellet challenged the sandbar figures. She produced the guild records. He challenged the current measurements. She produced the float readings, witnessed by the Westhaven harbourmaster. He challenged the correction to his tables. She showed the derivation formula, step by step, and offered to go through it at whatever pace was helpful. The room grew quiet in the way rooms do when opinion begins yielding to evidence. Pellet recognized the moment. He gathered his papers. "If this board intends to place an unaccredited woman above the appointed engineer," he said, "I shall submit my resignation." Lord Kell looked at him. "The corrected bearing will be adopted pending independent verification. If you choose to resign, that will be accepted." Pellet left. The door was shut with more force than the situation required. 3 weeks later, a report was submitted to the Board of Trade recommending the corrected bearing and the seasonal approach specifications. The author listed was Fletcher Pellet. The calculations inside were Miriam's, including, in one place, a marginal notation she recognized as her own handwriting, transcribed without the correction she had later made, retained in Pellet's neat professional hand. She read it twice in the front room of the chemist's shop, with the evening light going grey through the glass. "He took the work," Joseph said. "He took all of it." She set the report on the table, including an error I had already corrected in the final version. He copied from an earlier draft. She was quiet for a moment. "Bring me the correspondence file, everything dated." The crisis arrived before the exposure did. A naval survey cutter, HMS Aldermore, running a verification pass of the new route in early December, met an unexpected gale 3 miles north of the Callow Ledge. Her captain, operating from Pellet's approved chart, ran the original bearing. The corrected specification had not yet been formally issued. In 2 hours, in deteriorating conditions, the Aldermore would be on the sandbar. Word reached Westhaven by signal lamp at 4 in the afternoon. Miriam was at the breakwater before the harbourmaster had finished decoding the message. The approach bearing on their chart puts them 16 degrees east of where they need to be, she said. If they correct in these conditions without compensation for the surge current, they will overcorrect and take the ledge. They need the exact compensation angle, the timing sequence for the passage, and the speed correction for the cross-current. We cannot signal that detail in this weather, the harbour-master said. I can signal it. She looked at Lord Kell, who had arrived from the regional office and had asked to this point only practical questions. I need the lamp and the time they began their approach. He said 2:15 and moved to clear the lamp housing. 40 minutes. The cold was significant. The lamp required consistent timing. She worked from calculations she had done in the carriage on the road from the regional office, the compensation angle, the timing sequence, the speed correction for the February cross-current at this specific bearing. She had measured this breakwater's signaling geometry in 3 different weather conditions over 2 years. She used all 3 now. The Aldermore came through the channel entrance at 4:30. Miriam folded her calculation sheet into her case. Lord Kell stood beside her in the wind. Pellet's chart nearly put them on the bar, he said. Yes. Yours would not have. No. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you need to expose what he did? Documentation, she said. Dated. Witnessed. Everything I sent you, everything the board received, the error that appears in his submission, but not in my final draft. It requires no argument. It simply requires being placed in order and read. Then let us place it in order. The inquiry was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Miriam's original draft charts, time-stamped by the regional office, predated Pellet's report by 6 weeks. The guild records were in her handwriting. The marginal notation he had copied, including its uncorrected error, was in her format, not his, a detail that required no expert to interpret. He argued she had obtained materials from his office. Lord Kell asked who specifically had provided them and on what date. Pellet could not answer. His submission was withdrawn. Miss G's corrected charts were entered into the official record under her full name. The channel bearing was amended. The seasonal specifications were published. The route carried its first commercial vessel in February on the corrected approach, without incident. The Admiralty did not immediately offer Miriam a full consultancy. Institutions that were not designed for movement do not move quickly. But Lord Kell was not the Admiralty. He met with her in the week following the inquiry's conclusion, with Crispin taking notes in the corner of the regional office in his quiet, efficient way. I am commissioning a complete seasonal survey of the northern approach, Lord Kell said. Annual monitoring of the Callow Ledge. Sandbar projections updated every 3 years. Approach specifications reviewed with every new vessel class approved for this route. He looked at her. I am asking whether you are willing to perform this work. With a formal contract, a fair fee, and your name on every document you produce. What fee? She said. The question did not surprise him. Nothing she did surprised him anymore. He had simply learned to expect precision, and to find it, in some quiet way he had not anticipated when he first set her letter aside, the most clarifying thing he had encountered in years. He named a figure. She raised an eyebrow. That is what Pellet was paid. Yes. For work he did not perform. Yes. Then that is what I want. For work I will. He almost smiled, agreed. She held out her hand. He shook it. Neither of them made it more than that, and it was enough. The official chart of the Northern Maritime Approach was issued the following spring. Beneath the Admiralty seal, the specification line read, Navigational Specifications. M. Slade, Coastal Analyst. Lord Kell had written the draft. She had corrected it. Miriam Slade, she said when she saw the initial. Some members of the board prefer. Miriam Slade, she said again. He looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed out the initial and wrote the full name himself with his own pen. When the printed copies arrived at the Westhaven shop 3 weeks later, she read her name on the specification page and then read it once more, and then walked to the window and stood there for a moment, with her back to the room. Joseph did not say anything. He understood that some things do not need commentary. They need only space and a few seconds to be real. The chart was reprinted twice in the first year as additional vessels were approved for the route. Both reprintings carried her full name. By the 3rd year, Slade specifications become the standard term in the northern ports for the seasonal bearing adjustments that kept deep draft freighters off the Callao ledge. Most of the men who used the term had never met her. Most of them pictured automatically, without examining the assumption, someone other than a woman above a chemist's shop who had begun keeping tide records at the age of 9 because her father had shown her how the light moved on the water. This was a failure of imagination on their part. The specifications were no less sound for it. Lord Kell travelled to Westhaven the following autumn, officially to review the first annual ledge survey, which Miriam had completed in September, and submitted with the precision of someone who understood that the work's value lay in its consistency over time. Unofficially, he had been finding reasons to travel to Westhaven with some frequency since December. He found her in the back garden at a table in the late September light, correcting proofs for a paper she was submitting to the Naval Review, the same journal that had published his rebuttal of her work 3 years earlier. He sat across from her without being invited. She had long since accepted this as a characteristic of his. "They'll publish it," he said. "Perhaps," the editor objects to Section 4. Section 4 is the strongest part. "I know," she made a mark in the margin. "He'll arrive at that eventually." A comfortable silence followed, the kind that takes considerable time and genuine respect to build. "I spoke to my solicitor," Lord Kell said at last. Miriam looked up. "About the consultancy," he suggested, clarifying the terms, "given that I intend to propose an extension." He paused. "A significant one." She set down her pen. In her expression, there was the steadiness that had been there from the beginning. On the breakwater, at the board table, in the wind with the signal lamp, and something else now quieter, that she did not routinely allow to show. "What kind of extension?" she asked. "A permanent one." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking you to marry me, Miss Slade, with a written contract specifying that your professional work remains yours in full, that your name appears on everything you produce, that no decision affecting your consultancy passes through my authority without your agreement, and that you retain the right to publish your findings independently, even where they conflict with Marlstone interests." He paused. "I have already drafted the terms. Crispin has a clean copy." She was quiet for a long moment. "Have your solicitor send them to my uncle," she said. "I'll review them and reply within the week." He blinked. "That is your answer." "That is the first part of it." She picked up her pen again and looked at him across the proof sheets, and in the September light the expression on her face was something he had not seen there before. Not the precision, not the patience, not the steadiness, but something simpler and more unguarded than any of those. "I love you, Lord Kell. I have for some time, but love without terms is a promise without specifications, and I have seen what unspecified promises become." A pause. "Send the contract, I'll sign it." He looked at her for a moment in the late afternoon light. "Tell me what else to include." She considered. "A clause specifying that you will not use your board connections to influence editorial decisions about my work, even in my favor." even in your favor. Especially in my favor. She made another mark in the proofs. The work should stand on its own, that is the whole point. He understood. She had spent 8 years making the work stand on its own, in correspondence that nearly went unanswered, under an initial because the world would read the initial and set aside the name, in a model made from tin and wire on a kitchen table in Westhaven that a Viscount had to travel 43 miles to see before he would believe it. She was not going to let love become the thing that finally taught the world to pay attention. She wanted the world to pay attention because the work required it. He said nothing more. He nodded. She went back to her proofs and between them, in the quiet of the autumn garden, something settled into its proper place. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular solidity of a foundation that has been correctly built. They were married in the village church the following spring. Not at Marlstone, not in London. In Westhaven, above the harbour, in view of the breakwater. Joseph Slade walked beside her. Kit, now 16 and 2 months into a navigation apprenticeship, Lord Kell had quietly arranged, carried the rings with the expression of someone trying to look as though this was a routine assignment. The contract was signed the morning before the ceremony. 3 pages, witnessed by Crispin Dove and Dr. Joseph Slade. Miriam read every line before she signed, which no one present found surprising. The northern maritime route is still there, my dear friends. The Calais ledge is still monitored every year by a coastal analyst whose name appears on the specification charts in the format Miriam Slade established. Full name, no initial, no husband's title preceding it. Just the name and the work and the water. Lord Kell kept the courteous refusal. The first reply his secretary had sent, before the survey, before Westhaven, before he understood what he had set aside on a grey November morning. He kept it in his desk alongside the original letter from Miss Slade with its exact handwriting and its tied diagrams, and the quiet certainty of someone who knew she was correct and intended to be heard regardless. In later years, when young men came to the estate for professional mentorship, he would take out both documents and set them side by side on the table. This one, he would say, holding up the letter, is expertise. Evidence assembled across years, without institutional backing, without expectation of credit, because the water was doing something dangerous and someone needed to say so. He would set it down. Then he would hold up the refusal. And this one is what happens when authority protects itself from the embarrassment of learning. He would look at whoever was sitting across from him, know the difference, and remember, the letter came first. He was not by then a man who made this distinction easily. It had cost him something to learn it. He understood that the cost was appropriate. Miriam, when he said as much to her one evening, looked up from the journal she was annotating and said, "Most genuine learning does cost something. That is how you know it has occurred." He had no response to this. He had learned, also, to recognize when she was right before she had finished saying it. The tide tables from the Westhaven Fishermen's Guild are still maintained. The seasonal approach specifications are still updated every 3 years. The sandbar is still monitored. The Calais ledge sits where it has always sat, shifting, patient, rising a few inches in the winters that are hard and settling back in the years that are mild. And every vessel that runs the northern route safely does so because one woman in an oilskin coat stood on a breakwater counting seconds and understood what she was measuring and refused to stop writing until someone was prepared to read. That, my dear friends, is the whole story. Not the romance of it, though the romance is real. Not the victory of it, though the victory was earned. The story is simpler than either of those things. A woman who was correct, who kept saying so, who survived every refusal and every theft and every room that was not designed for her, until the chart bore her name and the water bore out her figures, and there was simply nothing left to dispute. Subscribe to Moonlight at Marlowe if these stories belong in your evenings. Share this one if you know someone still writing their second letter. Still sending the calculation no one requested, still waiting for the survey to confirm what they already knew, still asking a world that was not built for them to reckon with what they know to be true. Tell them the fire is warm here. Tell them the story ends with the name in print. Tell them the tide journals were never foolish. They were simply waiting to be read by someone honest enough to understand what they were saying.